I'm Susan Poole, and I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves. Before I do that, I just really want to commend you on coming and choosing this event. There's so many events out here, but the quality of the speakers and the agenda has just been really impressive. So thanks to BTC Media and the sponsors as well. So on the panel today, we have Justin Newton from Netki. We have Amber Scott from Outlier Solutions. And we have Jagruti Solanki from Aprio. This is a lot of expertise on this topic, so I'm really glad that you chose to be in this room. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to super briefly introduce themselves. But before I do that, I always like to find out a little unknown, weird, or fun fact, which I haven't really told them about yet, before they introduce themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Justin. Justin's got a really cool background. He was heavily involved in the internet, started the first trade association for internet service protocols. Something kind of interesting, too, is he was involved in the first technology for denial of service. And we all know what that's about in our space, right? And then I refused to let him take 20 minutes on this story, but ask him afterwards about the time he was almost killed by a hippopotamus on safari while in his pajamas. I did vet this story, so it's very true.
Nice.
So welcome, Justin, and do you want to introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, hi, I'm Justin Newton. I'm the founder and CEO of Netki. After working the internet for a little bit more than 20 years, I got into blockchain, and we founded Netki to help foster the mass market adoption of digital currency and blockchain technology. And the reason that we're here and on the panel today is that we've focused a lot of our product development and product roadmap on identity validation, KYC, AML, fraud reduction, and kind of all those pieces around knowing who the people are using your system and are they using it in the appropriate way.
Awesome. Thank you. And then I'm going to introduce Amber. Amber's a ninja. You may not have seen her on America's Ninja Warrior because she's actually an AML and compliance ninja. So I don't know what kind of sports they do with that, but I know that's a topic that's super popular in blockchain. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Amber?
Mostly intellectual sports, and that's what happens when nerds get to make our own job titles. I really have kind of a genuine dislike for the pomp that comes with titles, so we did something really dorky, and it kind of suits everybody at our company. So we specialize in anti-money laundering, counterterrorism, privacy compliance, and regulatory compliance, which means that most of the time we are trying to keep people out of trouble. I don't represent any government agency or law enforcement, so that's really important to say. I know a lot about that stuff, but I am speaking on behalf of myself and not any of those agencies.
Excellent. Thank you, Amber. And Jagruti, another interesting background story. I was checking out your profile and saw that you were like a SWAT team member at university. And so I was like, SWAT team? Then I found out that that stands for Analyzing Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats, which is still major awesomely cool, but no weapons are involved in that, I'm guessing.
Yeah, no.
So tell us about yourself and about what you're doing at Aprio.
Sure, thank you, Susan. So I'm Jagruti Solanki. I'm an assurance senior manager with Aprio, and we are a CPA firm based in Atlanta. We are about 450 people plus at this point. Full-service CPA firm. We do tax, accounting, audit, IT assurance, PCI compliance, GDPR, and all the cool-sounding words. I have been with the company 11 years, and of the 11 years, I would say past 4+ years, we have been working heavily in blockchain space, providing tax, audit, accounting advisory services, and also kind of helping companies set up best practices in place, given that regulations are kind of behind what companies have been doing in this space. So that's the fun stuff I've been doing.
Thank you. So definitely we've got some different backgrounds and interesting viewpoints. So when we were engaging a bit before the panel and trying to think what would be relevant to everyone here in the audience, one of the topics came up, which is like, I didn't think of it, the panelists did, but it was so true. One of the challenges right now is that technology and blockchain technology is fast and global. But then you go to regulation and compliance, it's often slow and can be global or local. And so that's a huge issue right now. Is the technology going to outpace and form new regulations, or are the regulations going to come in and hamper down? And it's a concern many people have in the blockchain industry. So Justin, I'm going to ask your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I think all of us can definitely see and know that that's the case, right? And the positive side for all of that, it means that we as innovators are actually the ones that get to create the future, and that everybody else out there is just going to be catching up. The downside of that, though, means that when there's a place where the technology and the regulation don't hit each other, it's we on the technology side that are going to have to adapt to the regulators, at least in the short to medium term. We can't anticipate that the regulators are going to move to where we want them to be in a time that actually allows us to build our businesses and to move things going forward.
Okay, and Amber, from a compliance standpoint, is compliance going to just steamroll over this technology and slow it down, or do you think there's going to be ways that these can be combined for success?
So I think there's always an it depends, and there's always a trade-off that no one likes to talk to, that founders have to make, which is, what's the real risk that I'm dealing with? So the number one most common question I get is, I am doing whatever my activity is. Am I going to end up in an orange jumpsuit? And the second most common question that I get is, Uber gave 0 dams. They are operating, they are kicking ass in a bunch of jurisdictions, they are fighting regulation. Why can't I do that? And the answer is that there's different risks, depending on who your regulator is. If your regulator is the SEC, and they're the old school Wu-Tang of regulators, and they are not afraid to put you over their knob and spank you, well, that might be a little bit different. You are dealing with a real risk of some orange jumpsuit-itis. Whereas if you're talking about local taxi cab regulations, as Uber was, that's a very different thing. That's a very different level of power, although you're talking about a lot of different regulations in a lot of jurisdictions, no matter what you do. And this is the other bit, is that whenever someone comes and says, I want to deploy this thing, what do I need to do? Where do you want to deploy it? For the world. Well, in which one of those 180 jurisdictions do you want to start with? What do you want to know about first? Because they all might have something different. Yep. This is a really cool panel, I think, for me to be on, just because we have such different expertise, and this is true in every vector. And I'm sure that's true from a tax perspective as well. Yeah. Do you see the same thing?
Yeah, same thing. Like tax and accounting both. Like, we are seeing companies exploring blockchain technologies like the new gig for their business, but from an accounting standpoint, like I'm on the accounting side, AICPA is the regulatory body in the United States that kind of regulates the accounting standards. Just a few months back, they came out with their very first CPE, as Justin had pointed out earlier today. And companies are not waiting. I mean, you still have to get your accounting books right. You still have to produce financial statements. You need to finish your ICO tokens and projections and everything. I mean, no one is waiting for AICPA to come back and say, here's how I need to record transactions. IRS, to some extent, they have been ahead compared to AICPA. They came back a few years back and said, cryptocurrencies are property. Now with the new tax reforms, they at least took a lead in looking at like-kind exchanges and no more like-kind exchanges applicable for digital currency. So at least in that space, we see IRS is addressing some of the key issues that they have been, they have seen a lot more. From an accounting standpoint, we are still a little behind, especially considering the changes in the technology. I mean, until a year back, who knew what airdrops and atomic swaps were? Here we are, and I'm pretty sure it'll take a while for accounting standards to catch up to how do you now record these transactions.
Yeah. I would say that anti-money laundering is the same. So in Canada, we just had proposed regulation for virtual currency. And I think the most difficult part of that, I do not envy the job of our Department of Finance, is defining what virtual currency is.
So Justin, so you have a strong technologist view as well.
Sure.
The technology keeps going, right? We had Bitcoin, and then we had digital currency, colored coins, and then everybody started focusing on blockchain. And then there's ICOs. Now it's secured tokens, security tokens. So all that keeps going. What's kind of a technology view on regulation? Because I just don't see that blockchain train stopping because of regulation, and it's global.
And thank God it won't. right? I mean, let's be clear about that up front. But I think that what we need to be paying attention to as innovators and technologists is when we are building these new technologies, there's many cases where there's parallels and frameworks that we can take a look at that say not what is the technology that this problem is solving, but what's the problem being solved and what's the use case. And are there things that we can learn from the regulatory policy around that area that we can apply to our fields? Because, look, I'm not a lawyer. You should always talk to and consult one or experts like Amber around the way that you deal with your risk policies and things like that. But one of the things that definitely does come into play with many regulators is intent. And if they see that you're operating in an area where maybe the rules are not entirely black and white yet, but you're operating in a way that shows that you take seriously the same things that they care about and take seriously, that's going to go a long way towards getting you in the good graces. Now, if you're going to say, we have this brand new way to solve things that you don't really know or understand or do anything about, but you should trust it, that's not going to really work so well, and that's going to be an area where you're more likely to get in challenges. And so I actually just spent last weekend, working on compliance standards for security tokens. And when we were working on that, what we tried to do was design a system that when regulators looked at it, it closely mirrored the trust and control points that they were used to seeing and having in existing security environments, but was also designed in a way with flexibility so that as we can start to automate compliance with smart contracts in places where we use people today, that the technology will allow for that advancement and replacement in an easy drop-in place. But if we said first that that's the only way that it's going to work, what would happen is regulators would say, well, then you just can't issue security tokens.
But I mean, that's the SAFT, essentially.
Right, and so, finding a way when you're looking at these technologies to say, well, what's the future that we want? And let's make sure that we're building and planning for that. But let's not forget the world that we live in today and the fact that we have to comply with those rules and make those regulators comfortable so that they don't act as a friction point or a hindrance on our growth.
Well said. And in addition to compliance, there's accounting standards. So, the topic of the panel is about compliance, enterprise. So many enterprises out there are putting in either pilots or their first implementations of blockchain. And Jagruti, you have a lot of experience on the accounting side, which, just as Justin said, the traditional type of risk and compliance places that are in play, there's a lot of traditional accounting systems. And I know that you've had experience with a lot, like was it 4 or 5 years experience working with some of these blockchain-based entities? Yeah. What can you say about the accounting systems? Do people need to be aware of those and try to mirror today's, or is this a whole new Wild West again in another area of an enterprise?
Yeah, I think it is Wild West for sure. And then from an accounting standard, from an accounting side, I think the biggest challenge we see right now is that, you have your traditional accounting system, your ERP, NetSuite or SAP or whatever it might be, and now you got blockchain. All your transactions that are sitting on whatever blockchain the company is using. That's essentially like my third ledger sitting out there. As an auditor or as an external party or even the investors of the company, how do I know that the transactions that are on blockchain are captured in the accounting system? Like, companies are running transactions through their wallets. I mean, that's essentially not, none of these transactions are talking to the accounting system. So there's an inherent challenge on just to kind of make sure from a risk standpoint, is the company able to capture all the data and all the transactions that's happening outside in the system? And the financial statements that are being produced that eventually companies use for tax returns, is it complete data or is there something missing? So I think that's a bigger challenge. And to be honest, I think it's an industry challenge because there's no real, there are accounting solutions now that are coming up that kind of are bridging the gap between here's the third ledger, blockchain, and here's your ERP, and kind of creating some sort of platform that can kind of talk to each other, but it's not robust enough. And considering all the new transactions, like it's not just one kind of asset. You have multi-asset issues. You have Bitcoin, you have Ethereum, you have all the ERC20 tokens, you have Stellar, like multiple blockchain, multiple tokens. Everything has its own record. Compiling, consolidating that record, and making sure everything finally makes it to your main general ledger. I think that is probably a bigger challenge. And we are seeing a lot of instances where companies are way behind in making sure that's happening. Like if I have to get a wallet download of all the transactions, all I see is string of alphanumeric digits, Bitcoin paid from this address to the other address. Well, that doesn't tell me which
I'll put my
vendor.
hand up. We're behind on that.
Well, there you go. So that'll help.
Yeah.
But again, to that point, like tons of transactions, but if you don't do a good job of tracking to and from, and exactly who's the payer, who's the payee from day one, you might get to a point where there's so much volume that you're just sitting back and fixing historical information.
Yeah.
So I think that challenge needs to be crossed.
So I think that's true, but I don't necessarily think that that's uniquely a blockchain challenge. And I will say that as, hi, my bank, who is Scotiabank, someone came and deposited $2,000 at a bank branch into my account. So they came and they had the account number and they said, here you go, and you can do that. They were apparently not identified at the branch, so the branch doesn't know who they are. I can get no information on where this $2,000 came from. And I think, because it doesn't seem to be any of my customers at Outlier, that it was actually probably an error on someone's part. And I would love to know who that person is so that I can just give them their money back, because they're probably a little peeved about it.
Well, free
But in the
money is
traditional
awesome.
banking world, we still have these situations where money appears, disappears.
Right. Well, at least there is some mechanism at this point that can be tracked. I mean, I would expect that there's, hopefully those instances are not happening a whole lot if you have proper controls in place.
Oh, absolutely. But if it was Bitcoin, they could sign a transaction from the same address and show me, this is who I am, this was my $2,000, give it back. As it stands, there's just no record in the traditional banking world of who that is. So now, I guess I keep the money?
Free money is always good.
I mean, at least they gave me money and didn't take it, but it's still a bummer for someone.
Yeah, but I think the problem is more escalated with, a lot of crypto transactions. Yeah,
I would guess.
Fair.
Yeah.
So we've got a few minutes left, and there's always one kind of quirky question. Is that right? You guys okay with quirky?
Sure.
Quirky question at the end. I mean, if you haven't heard this question before and you're hearing it for the first time, you will hear it all the time. And yet, I can't wait to hear what your answers are. Part of compliance and enterprise and blockchain involves identity, just a whole other topic on its own, but it also involves, where does compliance fit in around what you put on a blockchain and what you store off-chain? And I know, Justin, you have some views on this that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, well, just from both a compliance but just a general architecture perspective, when you're thinking about what you want to put on chain, even for compliance or internal purposes, assume that anything that you're putting on chain will eventually be exposed to every participant on the chain. And so putting things like PII, identity, or even hashes of that information on chain, assume that that data is eventually going to be leaked. And so whether it's financial data, personal data, et cetera. And also know, because it's a blockchain, that you can't delete it. And so be really, really cautious, even on internal blockchains and internal networks, about putting any data that might be considered approximate to GDPR kind of privacy data, or other things like that, where you no longer have the controls that are required by law to delete or remove that data in the future. Mm-hmm. So I just advise people, when they're thinking about what they write to the blockchain, make sure their privacy lawyers are involved in that discussion. Because you can literally end up getting fines that accumulate for every day that you don't do something that's impossible for you to do.
Fantastic. So I'd like to give the panelists...
Can I add to that one, though?
Yeah,
because I think there's a flip side to that coin.
10
Yeah,
10 or
please.
15 seconds each. Or
Done.
that was your wrap-up, Justin. Amber, and then Jagruti.
Individuals have a right to privacy, full stop. So private information maybe doesn't belong on chain unless you're getting into things like zero-knowledge proofs that I don't think are quite there yet. Public institutions like governments have an obligation to transparency. And those things damn well belong on chain.
Agreed.
I totally agree to exactly what you both said. I mean, I'm just kind of, when I think about how smart contracts are eventually, kind of taking over the traditional form of contract from an accounting and audit standpoint, I'm just kind of scratching my head, and I'm like, how do I even audit those at some point? What's off the chain, on the chain, protecting the data? I think that those are definitely bigger issues than that need to be addressed before you can kind of even take your business to the next level. Protection of your data and the private keys associated with that.
Well, thank you, panelists. These are topics we could go on and on about. You hit some really key points today, and I'm sure the audience appreciates it. I'd like to thank Justin Newton from Netki, Amber Scott from Outlier, and Jagruti Solanki from Aprio. And they'll be around if you want to ask them any questions. Great panel.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
You.